Hi, everybody. My name is Rafi Kurlancic, and I am a solutions architect here at Databricks. I'm also the author of the bricksteR package for R. bricksteR is essentially today a series of wrappers around the Databricks REST API. And what I'd like to do in this video is actually walk through some of the source code so that you can understand how bricksteR works. And if you decide to contribute to it, it should make it very easy for you to do so. So we're going to go through two examples. If you look in the R directory of the project here, you'll see a bunch of different files. These are all essentially different functions that are those wrappers around different API endpoints for the Databricks REST API. Let's start by looking at the import to workspace function. I think that this is the first one that I actually wound up implementing and committing. So let's take a look at how this works. Before we get into all the gory details here, let's take a look at how you actually use this, right? So import to workspace requires 4 different parameters to be filled. You have a file, which is going to point to a local file or an R script anywhere really, where you have bricksteR loaded, and it is going to import it to the Databricks workspace as a notebook, an R notebook specifically. So therefore, you definitely want to specify a notebook path, and this is going to be in the Databricks workspace, the path where this file will be uploaded to as a notebook. Then you need to, for authentication purposes, you need to specify the URL of your Databricks workspace and an API token if you are not using netrc. Okay? So let's take a look now at what happens when you pass these parameters into this function and what actually gets executed. So there's a couple other parameters that are optional that you could put in here. So for example, you have overwrite, which is set to false. The idea being that if you happen to upload a new file or import a new file to the workspace at the same path, notebook path that something is already there in the same name, then to avoid, unwittingly kind of overwriting an old file that you wanted to keep, we turn overwrite to false. And if you do want to overwrite, you just have to set this to true. Verbose equals true is another default that will essentially print out the API response for you in a nice way, and then you can turn that off if you want less output. Now, what do we actually do with that file? So the first thing that we do in this function is we create a list, and this is going to be the payload for the post request that we're going to make. So this is a named list where the path is going to be the notebook path. This is what's going to be expected by the Databricks REST API, right? So the path is going to be the notebook path, the language is R, the content is going to be uploading the file, and we're going to use the HTTR package to do that. So it's going to reach out to that particular path on your local machine, let's say, and upload the file through HTTR. And then obviously, whatever we want the overwrite setting to be, that gets added to this payload as well. Now, the next step here is if the token is null, which is the default. So if you have not supplied a token, then we will use netrc to authenticate. And the way we do that is by setting with HTTR config, we're going to set netrc to 1. That means essentially we are going to use that. We're setting that flag. And then the result of our post request, okay, this is us actually making the API call right here, is with this config of using netrc, we will post to the URL that consists of our workspace and this API endpoint this payload that we defined above. Okay, that's all we need to do to import a notebook or import an R file to the Databricks workspace. If we're not using netrc, then we'll use bearer authentication. Okay, so if we're not using netrc, then we will use bearer authentication. We'll actually pass in a string with the token and use that to authenticate. So we're going to create headers here. Okay, it consists of this string right here, and then when we make the request, we don't need any of that netrc stuff, but we will make a post request to the same API endpoint, except for this time we're just going to add headers, and the payload is going to be the same. But it's the only change. Okay. Now, if we have verbose turned on, then we'll return. Then essentially we'll return some messaging back to the user. And if the status if the status code is 200, meaning it was a successful post request, then we'll return that nice tidy kind of output here of, hey, the status was 200, and this file was added to the workspace at this particular notebook path. Okay, awesome. Now, if the request was not successful, then we will return um, uh, the response code, and then we will also print out a message saying, hey, sorry, it wasn't successful, and here's the entire API response that we got back. And then lastly, we return, regardless of whether we do verbose is true or false, we return the API response so that people can save it and parse it how they want to. And that's pretty much it for importing to workspace. That's the the logic of how this function works. Let's take a look at one that's a little bit more complex. So this create job here actually has the option to create a job from an R file sitting on your local machine. So it actually calls import to workspace within create job. Let's take a look at that. So in this case, right, this function, we're going to have a few extra parameters here. Okay, so we're going to pass a name. All right, it's going to be the name for the job. And then file is going to be optional in this case. So if we already have a notebook in our Databricks workspace that we want to turn into a job, then we can simply reference the notebook path. Okay, but if we have a file that we want to turn into a job and it's not in the workspace yet, and that's how we're engaging with Databricks, then we can specify the file just like we did with import to workspace, and the notebook path will then just be the place that the file gets put, right? So if we don't specify a file, then we're picking something from the workspace. If we do specify a file, then we're putting something in the workspace and using that as the notebook that we're using for the job. The default is a job config that you'll see kind of hard coded in here for the most part. You can pass your own JSON file or a JSON string as a job config. And then the job config, for those who may not know, the job config consists of the cluster configuration, the notebook that you're going to use, the name of the job, if you want to do like retries or alerts for failures and things like that. Workspace, the token, verbose, that's all the same from before. And we have, of course, the ellipses here so that we can pass additional parameters to the import to workspace function. Okay, now let's walk through. Now that we understand the parameters, let's actually walk through how this is implemented. If the file parameter is not null and someone has supplied a file that they want to create a job from, so then let's run the import to workspace function that we walked through before, and then we'll provide the file that way. And the notebook path will be the notebook path from create job. Okay, so we'll execute that function. If the import is not equal to 200, then we'll return a response that says, hey, sorry, couldn't import your file. Take a look at the response code and see what the problem was. Now, the other piece is, so if the response code is 200, then great, keep going on, right? If there is a file, if the job config parameter was a path to a JSON file, okay, then make sure to read the JSON there and get the job config in a form that we can actually use to make the API request. Okay, so this just requires a little bit of handing off back and forth from to JSON and from JSON. Okay, now If we do not supply a job config, then we'll use the default, which is the string that I mentioned before. And then at that point, really, everything is very similar to what we saw before, right? When we actually make the API request, it's very, very similar. If there's no token and you're using netrc, so then we will specify that we're using netrc. We'll add that to the config of our post request. And the only difference here is that this time, the URL that we're hitting is this API endpoint, and the payload is the job config instead of the files that we're uploading or importing to the workspace. If we're not using netrc, then we'll use bearer authentication like we did before, and we just specify that we're adding headers. In this case, we are also specifying that the content is JSON. Last time it was not JSON. Remember when we're uploading notebook files, that's not JSON necessarily. And then the body is the payload like we had before. So that's actually making the request, right? The responses are going to be saved into this variable here. Now, if the API code is, if this request is successful and the response is 200, then what we want to do is we actually want to dig into the content of the response, okay? And we want to dig out the job ID from that response. And the way that we do that is we're going to get the content from the results object. All right, it's going to be in raw form. We're going to convert that from raw to char, okay, to characters. And then from there, we're going to convert that to a data frame from JSON, okay? And then it just happens to be that that will give us a data frame back. And then this subsetting is going to give us the job ID. All right, so now we have the job ID, and then if people have specified that they want, verbose to be true, which is the default, then we'll have a nice printout for them about the name of the job that they just created, the API response code, and the job ID. If you have an unsuccessful request, then we will handle that by saying, similar to what we said before, sorry, didn't work out. Here's the JSON response. Hope you can figure it out yourself. The last little difference here is that sometimes, depending upon what kind of a function it is that we're implementing, we want to return more information, and this is where sometimes bricksteR can add more value, is returning things back from the API response in an R-friendly format. Not everybody wants to just get the JSON back. Sometimes you want a tidy data frame of all of the runs or all of the jobs in your workspace that you've created, and so that you can analyze them and kind of stay on top of them. So there's a lot more work to be done there, but essentially, oftentimes, I always want to bring back the raw response and then any particular other bits of data that are really important to begin working with in other API calls. So in this case, we're going to return the job ID, and then we can go to the run job API and just pass that job ID to the run job function, and it'll kick it off. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I think between the two of those examples, you should be able to go through the rest of them and kind of understand how the API endpoints fit in there, and then how to structure the R code to actually create a new wrapper around a different API endpoint. Thanks so much for watching, and if anyone decides to contribute, that is truly appreciated. So thank you very much.